Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and some lovely soothing merch to make your days and nights sweeter. If you're new here, well, first of all, welcome. We're so glad you found us. Second, let me take a moment to explain the concept of this show. You know the first part of a book, where you're just watching a character move through some normal parts of their life, the part before the inciting incident? Well, if you ever wish that part could be longer, that you could hear more about what they ate for dinner or what they saw while they walked home from work and not have to worry about the big plot twist coming up, then, friend, I'm your huckleberry. I write conflict-free fiction, stories that expose small moments of everyday life and elevate them with extra coziness. The effect, we hope, is that as you listen, you feel good, you relax. Maybe you even notice some of these bits of ordinary magic in your own life. We think these episodes pair well with your commute, chores around the house, a walk, or just some downtime snuggled up on the couch. And if you stick around after the last story, I'll give you some behind-the-scenes info on the village and dreaming this world up. Now, speaking of feeling good, let's take a big breath in through the nose and sigh from the mouth. Again, in and let it out. Good. Our stories today highlight some lovely Spectator experiences in the Village of Nothing Much. We'll settle into the joy of stepping back and observing. First, we'll stroll down to the park and toss a blanket over the grass where we can listen to the crack of the bat as the innings pass in At the Diamond. Then we'll button up a flannel shirt, stop for a cup of hot cider, and climb to the top section in the Bleachers. Finally, we'll settle on the patio, around the bonfire as it snaps and crackles, and wait for the clouds to clear in Harvest Moon. At the Diamond. It was becoming a Sunday afternoon tradition. Since the spring, when, on a walk through the neighborhood, I'd seen a small crowd at the park. I'd been curious and wandered over to see what was drawing people past the playground and paths. Then I heard the crack of the bat, and a few moments later the satisfying sound of a baseball landing in a glove. It had been years since I'd seen a game, and while this was just a neighborhood league in matching t-shirts, it reminded me of games I'd gone to as a child, sitting high in the stands with piles of peanut shells at my feet and snow cone stains on my lips. So all summer, whenever I was free on a Sunday afternoon, I'd been making my way over to the park, sometimes cheering with the small crowd of friends from the bleachers, and sometimes stretching out on a blanket under a tree, enough out of the way to be safe from foul balls, but close enough to hear the score called out every once in a while. Today would be a blanket day. The sky was a bright, clear blue without a single cloud, and the air was warm and humid. At home in the back hallway, I took a blanket from the shelf in the closet and carried it out onto the patio in the backyard. I shook it out and watched as dried blades of grass fluttered down to the ground. Among the blades were a few wildflowers I'd picked the last time I'd used it. They were a faded blue with a yellow ring where the petals met the stem. I scooped them up and set them on a rock by the bird feeder, thinking that they might be useful in someone's nest. I folded the blanket, tucked it under my arm, and went back to fill a bottle with cold tea and fish my sunglasses from the drawer in the entryway. When I stepped out onto the front porch, I lifted my face to the sunshine and let it warm me to my bones. I knew there would come a day, many months into the winter, when I would have forgotten this feeling, when it would have gone from my body, and I would daydream about blinding sun and thick heat. So I took every opportunity to build the stock in my system, hoping to make it last a little longer before I forgot it. It was a few blocks to the park, and I took my time. In the next street over, a sprinkler was slowly rotating arcs of water into the air, tiny rainbows appearing and disappearing as it fell. There were kids in swimsuits, jumping through it, racing up to it and shrieking as the cold water fell on them, then taking clumsy leaps over the bar and lining up to do it again. The water trailed down the edge of the lawn and spread over the sidewalk, and I breathed in the scent of wet pavement on a hot day that smelled the same as when I jumped over sprinklers myself as a child. It's a little different than rain on pavement, though that is lovely too. Rain carried its own perfume that water from a spigot can't produce, and I found myself looking forward to the rainstorms that come in the autumn. I could hear the crowd in the park calling out, "Hey, bada bada," the teasing rivalry of people who've played together for years. They were likely already a few innings in, and that was fine by me. Baseball games are long, and the nice thing about that is that you can show up a ways into play and be caught up in a blink. I carried my blanket and bottle past the swing sets and merry-go-rounds. There was a long slide with a soft pile of wood chips at its bottom, and I had a sense memory of skidding down one during recess, the soles of my sneakers pressed to the length of the chute to slow me down, and to make long, squealing squeaks, a sound I never got tired of as a child, though our poor teachers and helpers probably still heard them in their dreams. Past the playground, I followed the path around the back of the baseball diamond and found a shady spot under a tree. I tossed my blanket out and kicked off my shoes, stretched out. I stuck my toes into the sun and slipped my hands behind my head to look up into the branches. So many leaves, layers and layers of them. And high up I could see a wind I couldn't feel on the ground. I knew they couldn't, but still wondered if a leaf might have a preference, wanting to be up high, to be tossed in the wind, or down low, near a bird's nest. I let my eyes close and listened to the game. From what I heard, it was the bottom of the fourth inning, and the score was 4-2. I didn't come to watch the play, but more to be near the atmosphere. I didn't care who won or by how much, and suspected that was true for many of the people in the bleachers. I just liked being near people, doing something they enjoyed. Hearing the score called out reminded me of days riding in my grandfather's truck. The crank windows rolled down, and my legs sticking to the vinyl bench seat as I rode beside him. The baseball game seemed to be on the radio no matter what time of day it was. And while I hadn't understood the plays as they were called, I liked riding along with him, the voices of the announcers as familiar to me as his voice. I shifted on the blanket, feeling a root under my shoulder, and sat up to take a sip of my tea. I'd let it brew a bit too long, and it was sharp and strong, but it perked me up in the heat. I propped up onto my elbows and watched the game for a few minutes. A ground ball went skidding past third base, and the shortstop scooped it up and tossed it back to the catcher, who caught it with practiced ease and dropped back down into a squat as the next batter stepped to the plate. I liked watching the way a batter would work their feet into the dirt, shifting their weight and swiveling their heels till they felt well planted. Sometimes there is nothing more grounding than the feel of the actual ground. The batter pulled the bat around to her back shoulder and looked out to the pitcher's mound. When the pitch came, she swung for it and sent it with a loud crack all the way over the fence. Her team hooted and called out as she ran the bases. The center fielder dropped his hat in the grass in frustration and started trotting out to get the ball. I smiled on my blanket and laid my head back in my hands. In the Bleachers. We'd thought of it months ago. We'd been on a walk in the earliest days of the summer. In fact, it might have been on the first truly warm day of the year. That's when every moment, with your face turned toward the sun, makes you shiver with energy and excitement at being out of the house and in the open air. And you look forward to getting good and hot and doing all the summer things. Well, that runs its course by the end of the summer, when you'd give your eye teeth for a cool, rainy day to curl up by a window and read a book. By then, you begin to look forward to doing all the autumn things. And this was the autumn thing we'd thought of that day, on that sunny summer walk. We'd been walking through a neighborhood, looking at the pots of geraniums showing up on front steps, when we'd noticed an empty lot between two houses. It didn't look like a house had ever stood there. I guessed it had always just been an open space of grass and wildflowers. But there was a path worn through that reached far back to the line of trees. And we both turned to each other, tilting our heads like dogs listening for their favorite word. "Shall we?" I asked. "Let's." And we stepped onto the path. The path was sandy earth laid bare by many feet, and as we made our way along it, I heard the slight crunch of a grain of sand scraping along a pebble under my foot. The grass was thick and bright green and full of crickets hopping along in front of us, leading our way. Soon we were in the shade of the trees, with their leaves newly full and unfurled in the air above us. The path persisted, and we followed. We stopped to squat down at the base of an elm tree to look at what we guessed were a troop of morel mushrooms. We left them to their business, but I bookmarked the spot in my mind for a return visit after a bit of schooling on mushroom identification. I smiled thinking of that quote that all mushrooms are edible, but some only once. The path led us to step right through the low divided trunk of a tree. It split just a few inches above the ground and was growing twin saplings that straightened into parallel, upright, thin-barked trunks just after their initial angled inception. I remembered learning a word for the opposite of this, inosculation, a rare sight when two trees grow into each other. I supposed there were lots of ways to grow. We stepped out from the cover of the trees and blinked up at the shapes in front of us, which took a moment to resolve and be recognized. Upright pillars that looked like giant cactus arms against the blue sky, steps leading up in a vast field dotted with white and yellow. We both laughed when we realized where we were. We'd snuck up on the back of the high school football field. I guessed the path marked the way back and forth for scores of teenagers on school days, with their backpacks slung over their shoulders, their sneakers kicking through the pine needles and old dried leaves. We raced each other from one end of the field to the other, and bounced our voices in long, confident echoes across the bleachers. I couldn't remember ever doing anything like it when I'd been a high schooler. In fact, I'd probably avoided spots like this. But I'd grown out of shyness long ago, and it felt powerful to run through the place and fall laughing on our backs on the soft field. That's when we'd made the plan to come back and watch a game on a cool autumn night. I'd forgotten about it until I'd seen the schedule of games in the community calendar section of the local paper. And now that the evenings were getting chilly and the leaves were starting to shift into reds and oranges and yellows, well, it sounded like a lovely night out. We bundled up a bit, our fall jackets and scarves over flannel shirts, and decided to trace our steps as we did before, down along the neighborhood streets where pumpkins were replacing the geraniums, and through the path into the woods. There's that pleasant, eerie tingle at the back of your neck when you're out on an autumn night. Something instinctive that must be why we put our holidays for celebrating spookiness here rather than in the spring. And I felt it as we stepped into the woods. We both must have, because we reached out and caught each other's hands as we walked. We stepped over the split tree, and we heard the band playing and could see the bright stadium lights shining through the branches. When we broke through the edge of the woods, we saw folks in the bleachers and felt that energy we'd tapped into in the summer that pushed us to jog around to the sideline and find our way to our own spot in the stands. We passed the concession stand and decided to supply ourselves with hot drinks, one cider and one coffee, and a big bag of popcorn that we could share. Around us, high schoolers strode in small packs, laughing or pretending to laugh, while also pretending not to look to see if a certain someone in another pack was watching. I remembered how crucial those nights had felt at the time, each one loaded with potential and possibility, and demanding to be made the most of. I was glad that my evenings had been dialed back as I aged to much more mellow affairs, and thought that must all be part of the process. The bubbling pot of emotion and urgency that pushes us through the early years slows to a steady simmer as we add experience and wisdom to the mix. We stepped our way up through the bleachers, passing groups of parents and teachers chatting away and sipping from cups. We scuttled along a row near the top and settled down onto the chilly seat. We propped the bag of popcorn between us and snacked away as we looked out over the field and listened to the mix of tuning brass instruments, clapping hands, and cheering chants. Coaches pumping up their players and the crowd calling and chatting. Up high, the air was deliciously brisk, stinging my nostrils as I took in a deep lungful. I let the steam from my cider warm my face, and as a whistle blew on the field, settled in to watch the game. harvest moon. We were ready for it. We had a wheelbarrow full of split wood and gathered kindling, small scraps that had fallen over the summer from the oaks in the backyard, all piled high. We had sweaters pulled from bottom drawers that hadn't seen use in months to keep away the chill, and a quilt to cuddle under when the sun went down. And it was going down a bit sooner each night. There are times of year when I lost track a bit of the sunrise and the sunset. But the end of the summer, and likewise the end of the winter, are not those times. At the end of the winter, when the days are gaining a minute and then two with each rise and set, I'd notice my morning drive was just a little brighter, my evening walk could go a block further, and each of those small additions felt like encouragement. Somehow, when the days retreated at the end of the summer, it felt the same way. Still affirming, even still energizing, but just in another direction. To go in instead of out. So instead of a long walk tonight, we'd light the bonfire and watch the moon. In the kitchen, while the light was fading, I took 2 big russet potatoes from the basket in the pantry. I pricked them all over with the tines of a fork and rubbed them with olive oil, dusted them with salt and pepper, and wrapped them well in foil. While the fire was lit, we'd settle them in the embers and let them cook through for a late-night snack. I carried the kitchen scissors out to the garden and found a clump of chives still growing and flowering by the edge of the garage. Chive flowers are edible and a bright, pretty purple. I cut a handful of the herbs and flowers and carried it all back in. Already the kitchen was deeper in shadow, and I had to turn on a light over the sink to see. Years ago, my grandmother had found me in the kitchen with a cutting board full of chives, trying awkwardly to dice them into tiny rounds with a chef's knife. She'd cleared her throat, taken the scissors from the drawer, held the stems neatly in one hand, and snipped them into perfect pieces with the other. She'd handed them back to me, fitted the scissors into my grip, and taken away the knife all without saying a word. I'd snipped ever since. Out in the yard, I heard the breaking of a few more twigs and peered out the window to see sparks igniting in the fire pit. I smiled to myself. I could take my time with our potatoes and drinks. This would take a few minutes. The trickiest part of the fire was getting it started. I suppose that was true in quite a few instances, like getting a new routine rolling or building a new habit. Once the fire is lit, it could burn for a while, and it was just a matter of feeding it, but getting it to catch, to sustain itself, that took the most effort. It reminded me to be a bit more patient with myself and with others. For better or worse, we all felt the pull of momentum. I laid the potatoes into a bowl and poured 2 tall glasses of cold mineral water and carried them out to the fire. The flames were still small, being fed with scraps of dry grass and pine needles, blown on periodically with great puffs of air, and then watched to see if they had found purchase in the kindling. I chuckled to myself and went back in for the blanket. By the time I was nestled under it, on the long bench outside, the fire had caught and was crackling. I shared my blanket and an arm went around my shoulders. We propped our feet up on a log in front of us and sat in the quiet together. We hadn't had many fires this summer. The few times we did, we'd barely had time to enjoy them before the bugs chased us inside. But now that the evenings were getting cooler, there was no pesky buzzing to swat at. In fact, the nights were very quiet. The fire crackled, and the breeze blew softly through the trees. We stayed quiet too, not needing to say much, just taking turns occasionally to add more logs to the fire and turn the potatoes as they roasted. Have you ever felt your heart brim in a simple moment? A sudden awareness of all that you have and how glad you are for it? That's how I felt. In the quiet of the backyard, snuggled together under the quilt, waiting for the clouds to move aside and show us the moon. Sometimes I got caught in the weeds in my own mind, bogged down with things that didn't actually matter, but somehow got mislabeled as urgent and essential. Moments like these set me back on solid ground. There was a patchy cloud covering the moon, thin with ragged edges like a scrap of old fabric floating in a dark pond. It moved in eerie, slow motion, the glow of the moon behind it making an orangish halo in the air. A shiver ran up my spine, and I found myself looking forward to a bit of spookiness in the next month. It pairs so well with chilly days and spiced air and falling leaves. The arm around my shoulders tightened, and we both looked up together to see the moon in all her autumn glory making her appearance. The harvest moon is the full moon closest to the autumnal equinox. It rises close to sunset and reflects the last rays, making it glow with orange light. I like the names of different moons. A blue moon, which wasn't blue at all, but rare. The hare moon in May, the mead moon in June, the corn moon in August. Of course, it was all the same moon, the same one my great-great-great-grandparents had swum under on hot summer nights. The same one friends on the other side of the planet would go to sleep under in another 12 hours. The same one that rose and fell over every famous person and great figure in history and every dog that had ever lived. The same one that strangers all over the world spied from their windows, calling out to someone to say, "Have you seen the moon tonight?" I could smell the potatoes and thought they must be almost ready. The fire popped, and the air smelled of the good wood smoke. I breathed it in deeply and let it out. These were some interesting stories to reflect on. I think I didn't write about anything sports related in Nothing Much Happens for years because, well, for me it was never an obvious choice when I thought of cozy activities. And I think for those of us who were not athletic in school and maybe even felt a bit uncomfortable around the athletic crowd, or maybe we were bullied or made fun of, there was a possibility of bringing up painful memories. I feel like I might be exposing myself there a bit. No one is surprised to hear, I was a theater kid, right? But like so many, I did not have a good time in high school, not at all. And so for a long time, I left aside the idea of sports until I could see a way to reclaim it. Because as an adult, I enjoy watching some sports now. I love watching basketball, for example, like regular basketball, not men's basketball. And I feel healed up enough to see myself in spaces I used to feel very unsafe in. And I thought there might be a way to write about sportsing that felt comforting. In At the Diamond, I wrote about a memory of my grandpa's truck, how baseball always seemed to be on the radio, That is straight from my childhood for sure. And the voice of Detroit Tigers baseball for all those years was a man named Ernie Harwell. I just went back and listened to a few clips of him calling games. And my goodness, I was right back there in Grandpa's truck, which smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and would carry us to the hardware store and back on summer days. In the Bleachers, I took the idea of reclaiming enjoying sports a bit further, even stepping right back onto a high school football field. I wanted to paint that moment as joyful, as a place the narrator belongs, even if she didn't before. And I loved the idea of the path through the woods. One of my agents actually sent me a message after this episode first came out saying that all she had to do was imagine the stretch of bare grass between the two houses and the break in the fence, and it would send her right to sleep. The quote about mushrooms only being edible once is by Terry Pratchett. Friends have given me morels they've hunted in the past, and I have never been brave enough to eat them. I always accept them, and I bring them home, and I think this time I'm gonna go for it. But so far, I've bailed. It is on my list to take a little course in mushroom identification, and it will probably end up being a story one day. The last story we heard today is what I think of as a classic NMH tale. Sleepy, cozy, there's something yummy to eat, and nature is involved. I loved looking up all the kinds of moons there are and sharing my favorite way to cut chives. We grew them at our cottage when I was a kid, and I remember being fascinated by the idea that I could eat a flower. Yes, it tasted like onions, but still, it felt very Wonka. Like I say in one of the stories, I love being around people doing something they enjoy, especially when they don't care if other people get it or think it's cool. Show me your train set. Tell me about your garden. I like that you care so much about your collection or your hobby or your special interest. Keep doing it. Till we meet again, friends, have a lovely week and know that your neighbors in the village of Nothing Much are looking forward to our next visit.